Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm Mike Chikeen, and I'm very excited today to speak with Andrew Seidel. Andrew is a constitutional and civil rights attorney, activist, and author who has been defending the First Amendment in and out of court for more than a decade. His first book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, is a brilliantly historical and evidence-based thesis on why America was not founded as a Christian nation. His second book, The American Crusade, is about how the U.S. Supreme Court is currently and actively weaponizing religious freedom. Andrew has taken the fight to protect the separation of church and state everywhere he can, and I'm happy to be one of those stops. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I guess if you'll allow me, I'd like to start with the basics for those who might be confused or for people who think you're against all religion or all Christians. Tell us exactly what Christian nationalism is.
Christian nationalism is a political identity that really is based in Christianity. It's the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that we were based on Judeo-Christian principles, whatever that vague phrase might mean, and most importantly, that we've strayed from that foundation, right? That we've gotten away from our godly roots. And so they use the language of return, of, for instance, making America great again, to justify all manner of kind of hateful, evil public policy. And one of the ways to boil, I think, the idea of Christian nationalism down and the threat that it poses is to ask whether or not we have a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, as one of our famous presidents put it, or whether we have a government of the Christians, for the Christians, and by the Christians. And really, we're not talking about all Christians here. Really, we're talking about conservative, white, heterosexual Christian men, right? That's who Christian nationalists are out to favor. And Christian nationalism is an existential threat to our republic, to the American state. And that's one of the reasons that I actually wrote The Founding Myth. And I mean, another way for people to maybe conceive of this threat and this idea is that their goal is to rewrite or redefine the Constitution so that it creates two classes of people, Christians and everybody else, right? Or again, to be more accurate, that the right, I'm doing air quotes in an audio medium, my apologies, the right kind of conservative Christian and everybody else. So their goal is to codify Christian privilege and elevate Christians to this special favored class, and everybody else is going to be second-class citizens.
Right, because it seems like one of the important things of the American experiment is this freedom of religion. And one thing that it seems people on the right, the Christian nationalists don't get, that there's this freedom from religion that it seems like they want nothing to do with. That nobody can tell them how to live their lives, but they're supposed to be able to tell everyone else how to live their life. And yes. I'm sure these are things you're seeing right now everywhere you go.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is really, that question really strikes at the theme that runs through both of my books, The Founding Myth and American Crusade. And I'm going to get up on my soapbox here because this is just one of the truly remarkable things about America is the wall of separation between church and state, right? That concept is, as it's implemented, is an American original. That's an American invention. Yes, the idea was floating around in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely and worship freely by separating religion and government. And I think that is something that we can be proud of. And I certainly don't think we should let people undermine it with myths about founding as a Christian nation. And if you look at the US Constitution. Most of the truly original and unique elements of that Constitution are secular. Right? Our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from gods. Excuse me, that power comes from people, not gods. Right? The words "we the people" right there at the beginning, they're poetic, but they're also so much more. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or a deity. And it's godless by choice, not by accident. And in fact, there were people in the founding generation who objected to that choice. They were pissed off about it, and they tried to change it and have continually failed. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office. And that's in Article 6. And that was actually the only mention of religion in the original unamended documents, right before you get to the Bill of Rights. And it bans those religious tests in some of the most clear and emphatic language in a document that's often deliberately vague. So, the Constitution's often, the founders set out there like, we're just going to give you kind of like guidelines, and then you guys go fill in the blanks later on. But not when it came to the religious test ban. They said no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. No, shall, ever, any. I mean, those are clear, emphatic, strong words. And I will be the first to admit that there's a lot that is wrong with our Constitution. A lot. There's a lot that founders got wrong. But those secular foundations are one of the things that made it unique. And they are genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to all humanity. And those contributions are threatened, and they're undermined, and they're under attack by white Christian nationalism.
All right. Well, one thing that I read from you, I don't know if it was on social media or otherwise, but it was quite chilling. You said America will never be a Christian nation because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. And man, from the rhetoric you hear from the right, like we spoke a little bit that there was a pastor that's been burning your book, The Founding Myth, and has really used your idea that this is not a Christian nation, America is not a Christian nation, to kind of rally this sort of vitriol and fervent anger in his base that seems the GOP has been so good at for the past, 10 years plus. And do you have any sense of where this was born? I mean, like right now you have a Speaker of the House who says, if you want to know my worldview, go and read the Bible. So at some point it seems there was this shift from conservatism to straight Christian nationalism, and we're going to make this country exactly what the Bible says. Like, where might have this been born of?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it gets to the why that is at the heart of Christian nationalism. Like, why are we seeing this rise of Christian nationalism over the last decade, really, or even a little bit longer, you could say? Right. And the answer is that it is largely a backlash against equality realized. Right? So conservative white Christian Americans' status as the dominant group in American society is threatened. It has been for some time. They're losing the quote culture wars, which I think is a silly phrase that is often used to mask attacks on human rights. Their benighted ideas and ideology are wildly unpopular. They are losing at every turn the privilege and the deference which they believe they are due. And we know that when a dominant group or a caste in a society feels that its status is threatened, that it reacts or overreacts by seeking to retain that status. And that is why they're turning to Christian nationalism. That's why they turned to violent insurrection on January 6th. That's why they are tearing down democratic norms. That's why they're looking for these so-called strongmen like Trump and DeSantis. And that's why they're seeking the weapon of religious freedom, equality. And we've got some studies that actually back this up that I get into a little bit in American Crusade. The studies show that these Christian nationalists conflate demographic loss, right? So changing demographics, the fact that they're not going to be the majority, with a threat to their freedom. And not just to their freedom generally, but to their religious freedom specifically. And what that tells us is that they fundamentally misunderstand religious liberty as privilege. And the thing that's really important to understand is that equality, even when it means the erosion of privilege, is not discrimination, right? We're actually not in this country. We're not expanding rights or giving out new rights. We are recognizing rights that have always existed under the law, but were never enforced. We are affirming the humanity of our brothers and sisters and siblings and admitting that we've been wrong. So as we realize those aspirational values that are implicit in we the people and equal justice under law and these other founding maxims, as we recognize that humans are human and worthy of rights for that reason, conservative white Christian America is dying this slow demographic death and rebelling. They are raging against the dying of their privilege. And that is why you're seeing this spike in Christian nationalism right now.
Right. Yeah, that is really interesting because yes, demographically, obviously, if you're one of the tenets of your country is to take all the huddled masses, well, those huddled masses aren't necessarily going to be you. So just the way, like if you look at Canada, it's a really great example. When I was growing up in Ontario, it was all Western European Catholics that had come over to work after the war. And now if you're in Ontario, it is Indian, Arab, Chinese. Like there's a real plurality in Toronto, especially if you look for people that are maybe 20 and younger. You can really see it, and that's just kind of the normal progression of that society. And you don't see a lot of this replacement theory sort of bullshit in Ontario. You see a little bit of it, but I think it's because we've so been used to seeing different cultures and colors from the time we were kids. Like it was not odd for me to see a Hindu kid in my classroom, or it just wasn't. And well, you mentioned the culture war. I'd love to dive into that a little bit, because from my perspective, which is definitely outside the US and from whatever media I consume, it seems like the right is crushing the culture war. Like it seems like they're really taking these little things on the far left, any sort of issue that is not what they expect, and they're blowing it up. And it seems like there are things obviously on the left, like no political party is perfect, and there's such a plurality of people on the Democrat side that not everything is gonna make sense, and everything's gonna be for everybody. But it seems they're taking these smaller issues, and I think people will go to the ballot and say like, oh no, they're going too far left, when in reality it doesn't seem like those things are actually happening. Are you seeing something different?
No, I mean, I think largely you're right, but I want to clarify. Let me put it like this: Christian nationalists are not just wrong about what America is and how it was founded. Their beliefs and identity run counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded, right? That they are fundamentally un-American, but they're also wildly unpopular. Okay, so they oppose marriage equality, and they're going to try to get marriage equality overturned at the Supreme Court. That is 100% coming. Meanwhile, 71% of Americans support marriage equality. They want to outlaw abortion. Meanwhile, 85% of Americans think it should be legal in some or most circumstances. They want a nation of Christians like them, right? Not the pluralistic nation that you were talking about, right? And one of my great joys in life is I love the Olympics. I love watching the Olympics, and I feel like it's a time where you can be unabashedly just proud of your country and not worry about anything else. And it's okay. That's like one of the times where it's truly okay. And one of the things that I love about the United States is that if you don't have the flags next to the names, any name up there could be somebody competing from the United States, because of how diverse a country we are, and how anybody could rise up through the ranks of our athletes to represent the United States. It's one of the things that I truly love. But anyway, Christian nationalists want a nation of Christians like them, white Christians like them, but 73% of Americans are more welcoming of religious pluralism. And I think that Christian nationalists would also ban contraception. And you can see this in a couple of the cases that they've brought over the years. For instance, in the Hobby Lobby decision, which was handed down in 2014, so a decade ago, you could really see the beginning of this, even to the mifepristone case that's happening right now at the Supreme Court. But something like 91% of Americans are in favor of contraception. And those numbers terrify them. They are scared. And again, they're scared because nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right? Nuns are on the rise, because Americans are leaving religion behind, because we elected our first Black president and a Black female vice president, because we have marriage equality, because every day we are closer to racial and gender and LGBTQ equality, and because their status as the dominant group is threatened. Right. So overall, they are losing the culture wars, right? They look at those numbers, they look at that and realize we cannot beat public opinion. And so they are trying, as you pointed out, to push back against that. I mean, that is the movement of Christian nationalism. And they have a bunch of different tactics. And one of the tactics is to pick those most extreme edges and try to carve off some of the people in the center. You see this happening all the time over the existence of trans people. They do all kinds of just awful things to try to carve off, sections of the squishy middle to oppose the existence of trans people. I think though it really is a mark of how they are raging against the dying of their privilege. And I mean, yes, Mike Johnson is elevated to the Speaker of the House, and he is one of them, and that's terrifying. But it's that extreme element in Congress that has been empowered. And the other piece of it too is the courts, right? So I mean, and this is, to me, this is like arguably the most scary part. And I'm just going to go on a little bit of a tangent here because, I mean, it's not a tangent. There's a guy in the United States here for your international audience named Leonard Leo, very conservative Catholic, and he's kind of universally recognized as the guy who orchestrated the hostile takeover of the United States Supreme Court. And the reason that he is worth pointing out and mentioning is because a former employee described his mission like this, quote, Leo figured out 20 years ago that conservatives had lost the culture war. Abortion, gay rights, contraception. Conservatives didn't have a chance if public opinion prevailed. So they needed to stack the courts. Okay, so that's what they did. And notice the anti-democratic admission and goal inherent in that quote, right? If they don't stack the court, the majority is going to rule. If they don't stack the court, democracy is going to work. And this goes right back to that why that we've been talking about, the rising equality and the waning supremacy that is motivating so much of this Christian nationalism. And we know that Leo is responsible for basically five, but really six of basically all the conservative justices on the Supreme Court. And he chose them for their conservative ideology so that they would be this bulwark against public opinion and in favor of these deeply conservative and Christian nationalist policies that cut completely against where the country stands as a whole.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that even the way American politics are organized, like the electoral system, electoral college, how the Supreme Courts are, you're there for life. Like there's all these things that kind of unfortunately make it gameable in this way. And like if you lose a popular vote by nearly 10 million in most other countries, that wouldn't be a thing. And I think it's so hard for either side to, because one is trying to game it. The other side, I think Democrats would make some reforms on that, but then that would be looked at as political maneuvering as well. So it seems like they're locked in this dead heat where it would be great if they could just launch two more parties on either side. Because in any European country or Canada, you see since abortion isn't an issue in Canada, you'll have people in the middle really swing from the major parties, from liberal to the progressive conservatives, they call themselves. Whereas in the US, they can't do that because there's really that staunch group that is just so opposed to things like abortion that they will never vote for the other side just based on that issue.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting actually to see, really since the rise of Trump in the United States, how much the conversations around some of those things that you're talking about have changed. In fact, I'm thinking, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about how much I have changed. I'm a constitutional attorney, right? Like I was taught to revere the Constitution, that to enforce the Constitution, to uphold it. It's one of my great joys in life is to be able to say, like, I'm a constitutional attorney. I've dedicated my career to defending that. But there's so much that's wrong with that document. I mean, I have my little stump speech at the beginning there, which I say that stuff all the time about how the separation of church and state is an American original. It's one of the truly unique contributions. And that is all true. And I firmly believe that. But you could jettison the rest of that Constitution and still be kind of okay if you kept it. I mean, like, and the Electoral College, which you pointed out, like that has its roots in slavery. The Senate The U.S. Senate has its roots in slavery. And there's so much that is wrong with our Constitution. And so much of it actually goes back to that, I'm going to use the phrase, original sin of slavery. That, there's a really great legal communicator, Elie Mystal. He writes for The Nation. Hilarious, great follow on all social media, and he wrote a book that I highly recommend people go check out called "Allow Me to Retort." And in it, he makes a point that has really stuck with me. And essentially, he's talking about a lot of this same stuff, a lot of the stuff that's wrong with the Constitution. And he uses South Africa as an analogy, and he says, "Look, the apartheid government in South Africa wrote apartheid into their entire constitution. Right? There's not a way to salvage." Right. An apartheid constitution. There's not a way to salvage a constitution that is that racist and recognizes that half the population is lesser and is fixated on the idea of ensuring that population has no political power. Right? You have to start over. And that's what South Africa did. They threw out their apartheid constitution and started over. In the United States, we didn't do that, right? We had a whole civil war about this really important issue. And instead of tossing out that constitution and starting over, we added a few sentences to the Constitution. Literally, that's all we did. I mean, we amended it, but we added 20 sentences to the Constitution. And I often wonder, is that enough? I mean, if I were given dictatorial powers over the United States tomorrow, I would abolish the Senate and I would abolish the Electoral College, hands down. There's actually a really creative fix to the Electoral College that is gaining steam here in the United States. And in fact, Representative Jamie Raskin, who's a really remarkable, one of the few remarkable legislators we have in this country, great defender of democracy, crafted this back when he was a state level legislator. And essentially what it is it's states agreeing as states, so we have this interstate compact, to have their electoral college votes go in line with the popular vote, which if that were adopted would effectively wipe out the electoral college. It would use the electoral college to wipe out the electoral college, meaning that all of those states would just go with what the majority of the country dictated. And once it gets to 270, which is how many votes you need to win the electoral college, it goes into effect. So once that happens, once enough states sign on, it's game over, and the popular vote will always dictate the outcome of national elections in the United States, which we it's crazy.
Well,
that we
you
don't
would
have
think
that.
there are a lot, there's millions and millions of conservatives in California whose votes kind of don't matter for that state, because I don't know what would have to happen for that state to turn, conservative. But right now it's going to be Democrat all the time. And then there's 10, 20 million conservative votes that are kind of not counted, unless it's your representative. So it doesn't seem like a system that they would even think is fair. But I guess now with the popular vote going the way that it is, they just kind of want to lock in and say, well, we'll figure this out. We'll get this overturned on a state level.
Yeah. And I mean, the Senate is another example of that. I mean, California, the population of California, and these are not exact, but I'm not far off. The population of California is equal to the population of the 15 least populous states. It might even be 20 plus. Right. So those 20 plus states get 40 senators and California gets 2, even though California has more people. That's crazy.
It makes no sense whatsoever. But
yeah.
I'd love you to tell me a little bit about the Senate, because something I saw recently. So I have a lot of family near Venice, and so one of the last times I was there, touring the Doge's palace, I was reading that it seemed like Jefferson spent a lot of time in France and Europe before drafting the Constitution. And I went and did some Googling afterwards, and it seemed he got a lot of the idea for it's either the Senate or the House of Representatives from the Venice, the Serenissima. I think it's called the Chamber of 100 or whatever, the Room of 100. And so I was wondering how the Senate in the U.S. is connected to slavery enough that you would want to abolish it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not just that it's connected to slavery as a reason to abolish it. It's that it so tips the balance of power in favor of land instead of people, right? I mean, again, those, I'm using 20 states, but I don't know if that's accurate. So everybody go look it up for yourself. Those 20 states have the same number of people as California, right? Or take Wyoming, which maybe has 500,000 people in it compared to whatever California is, 30 million. I don't know. But like
Right.
the idea that those two senators from Wyoming get the same representation as the two senators from California is nuts. But that's the way it was designed, and it was designed to give states, not people, power. That's what the Senate is designed to do. And one of the reasons states wanted power was to ensure that slavery couldn't be overturned. Slavery was unpopular at the time, or not popular enough to be sustained. There was a majority of the country was against it. So the southern colonies, the South would not have joined the Union if they didn't have the power to keep it going. And you can see this in a couple different places in the Constitution. The Constitution goes out of its way, in fact, to not use the word slave. It also, for instance, treats slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of electoral power. And I mean, that is, I mean, it's so disgusting. But it's an example. It's a really good, it explains the problem that we're talking about right now, right? So essentially the slave states wanted slaves to count as people for the purposes of electoral power. So they wanted them to be people when it came to saying you get this many representatives, because then they would get more representatives, right? But if they're people, then they're not property and they can't be owned. So they're like, well, what do we do? And they come up with this 3/5 compromise, which is, you know, just a blight on American history and on our Constitution that still exists.
Is there anything to be said for keeping the Senate just for the way it passes policy? Like one kind of keeps a check on the other for the House and the Senate? Or do you think more along the lines that maybe if you were just to keep the House of Representatives, then you would just need to pass a threshold of X amount of votes inside there to pass a law, and then you're off to the races?
Yeah, I mean that's the argument, right? Is this the senators serve for 6 years? It's meant to be cooler heads prevail, meant to be a little less subject to whim fancy. I mean, yeah, it does. I don't see that playing out. But I also want to take just a moment to answer your question about the influences on our Constitution, because this is important, especially when we're talking about white Christian nationalism, right? Because one of the things that Christian nationalists argue is, again, we're founded as a Christian nation, and so they have all of this disinformation that is floating around out there that they push really, really hard to try to argue that the United States is founded as a Christian nation. And it's things that I think people have probably heard, right? Like the entire Christian nationalist identity depends on these lies and myths that we are one nation under God and in God we trust, and that the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 times, and that the founding fathers were all evangelical Christians, and that they prayed at the Constitutional Convention, then that the Bible influenced all of their principles that they put into practice in the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, and that George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge, and that our laws are based on the 10 Commandments, right? All of that I debunk in the founding myth. But without the historical cover that those lies give, really Christian nationalism as an identity begins to crumble. But you raised a really crucial one, and that's one of the things you'll hear from them often, is that the Bible provided more influence than anything else for the founding generation.
Come on.
And they will argue that at the Constitutional Convention, it was the most cited book. And you'll hear what they are doing is they're taking a study and they're completely misrepresenting what that study says. And so that's something that I correct in the founding myth. But the really fascinating thing is that, like, at the Constitutional Convention, right? So this is in Philadelphia. This is where the founding fathers are getting together in Independence Hall. They've closed all the doors. They've taken a vow of secrecy. And they're debating, like, how are we going to create this Constitution? What is it going to say? It's where we get the awful 3/5 compromise. It's where we get the really cool stuff about separating church and state, right? And Thomas Jefferson is in France at the time, right? He's actually not. He's got influence into this because he was an influential political thinker at the time, and because he's got the ear of James Madison, who's really influential at the Constitutional Convention. But he's not there. And we have all of the records from all of the delegates to that constitution, their journals, their letters to each other, the notes that they kept at the Constitutional Convention itself. Right, you can go look and see Ben Franklin's notes from the Constitutional Convention. You can see where he added a little note at the bottom when the founders, the framers at the convention are talking about, well, maybe we should have a prayer. And Franklin writes, the convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayer unnecessary, right? Like we know this, and we know because we have all of those records that they didn't turn to the Bible. In fact, they referenced it like almost 0 times. Almost 0 times. Ben Franklin references a story once, but it's not to say like the Bible says this, so we should do it. It's just to make another point, and he's using a story that everybody knows to make that point. We know that instead they turned for looking at like how do we put these principles into practice to the Enlightenment, to European thinkers, and then they skipped over basically all of Christian history and then go back to ancient Greece and Rome. So it's like they have ancient Greece and Rome, they skip a couple centuries, millennia, and get to the Enlightenment, and they're like, all the Dark Ages in between, when Christianity ruled, we're not gonna. That's how we don't want to do things. In other words,
right. That is insane how far they are taking this from everything that you've mentioned in the founding myth. It's like they're trying to build this evidentiary sort of history that never existed. Yeah. And so like, what are you seeing on the ground right now that Christian nationalists are really trying to push forward? And like, or is everything right now focused on the election at the end of this year?
Well, I mean, it's a couple of different things. I mean, for a long time, let me actually back up a second, because we've had various waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history. There was one after the founding. You get into the 1830s, you get this wave. You get a wave in the lead up to and during the Civil War. And that's where we get "In God We Trust" put on our coinage for the first time. And then you get another big wave in the 1950s when you have basically the big business is attempting to undo the New Deal, which put a lot of progressive policies into place. You have the rise of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, all this stuff. And that's where we get things like the National Day of Prayer. It's where we get "Under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance. It's where we get the National Prayer Breakfast, which just happened this morning, started. And all of these kind of artifacts from these previous waves of Christian nationalism become justifications for later waves of Christian nationalists. And they'll point to those and say, see, we are one nation under God, and in God we trust. And we have a national prayer breakfast. And they're like, yeah, but that's not from the founding, dude. That just started like a couple decades ago. And you can't really point to that as us being founded as a Christian nation. But this is the interesting thing, is that for a long time, Christian nationalism, this latest wave, was treated as a historical debate. Like, are we founded as a Christian nation or not? And there's no debate there. I mean, the facts are clear, and this is one of the things I try to point out in the founding myth. So you have to rip the mask off Christian nationalism and show that the point of those lies and that disinformation is not to show that, yes, we really are a Christian nation. It's for them to claim that they are the true heirs of the American experiment, right? That they are the true Americans and everybody else is lesser than. And that's one of the reasons that I use such strong language, why I call them out as un-American in the founding myth. Like, gentle corrections are not going to work on the Christian nationalists. It can't be, oh, here's what history tells us, here's what the founding fathers actually meant, here's what they've actually said. Correction is not enough, right? Otherwise, we never would have had a President Trump, right? Pointing out facts is not enough. Pointing out errors is insufficient. So the founding myth does that, but then it goes on the offense. It is meant to be an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Not only are they wrong, but their identity runs counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded. So, but to answer your question about what are they doing, what are we seeing, they don't have any new arguments when it comes to the history. They trot out the same disinformation time and time again, which is one of the reasons that I think the founding myth is such a valuable book. It's because I put 10 years of this fight into that book. Like, I've encountered every argument they've got and know why it's wrong and have successfully argued against them, including in and out of court. So I include all of that in the book, but they still do use all that to justify public policy today. And I mean, we're seeing that right now all the state legislatures, well, most of the state legislators legislatures around the country just opened back up in January, and so we're seeing this flood of just awful bills trying to use public government power to impose personal Christian beliefs on everybody else, and that's going to continue. And that is always worse in an election year. It's going to be particularly bad in this election year.
Right.
I do expect Christian nationalism to play a reasonable, big role, certainly rhetoric-wise, in this election. And the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that scares me the most, is seeing a repeat or something worse of what we saw on January 6th. And I helped write and spearhead and organize a report about the role that white Christian nationalism played in the January 6th insurrection. And we had a bunch of experts who joined that report to explain what happened that day and to show that Christian nationalism really was a key part of the insurrection. And the way that I like people to understand it is Christian nationalism provided the permission structure for the insurrectionists, right? You do not attack the beating heart of American democracy without thinking that a higher power is commanding you to do that, that you have justification to do that, right? And Donald Trump is their chosen one. I mean, he has said so himself. They believe he is chosen by God. And when you have a belief system like that and reality collides with it in the form of a 7 million plus popular vote margin against your chosen guy, violence is almost inevitable. So I'm deeply worried about the prospect of violence in this election. One of the things that I tell myself to ease that fear is that in the midterms, so in 2022, we didn't see much of the violence that we were worried about play out. And partly that's because we do have Joe Biden as president right now. And Donald Trump, when he was in power, could do a lot more to damage the country.
Right.
And aid that violence than he can out of power. So that's one of the things that I feel better about. But of course, if he were to win, then I mean, I don't know that the American Republic survives that. I don't think it would.
Well, it seems like there is a mix of Christian nationalists, like for the insurrection, for example, and then people that have just been whipped so hard by, whipped up so hard by YouTube and all of this. I think really like fake information. Like I hear so many people send me an article, and then I do 30 seconds of Googling, and there's so many facts. It's like, oh, this never happened. And so I think I would agree that it seems like the Christian nationalists are driving all of this because they want to get back into power. They want to impose the Bible or God's will on everyone else who, is not interested. And I think they're taking everyone else who's just angry at the economy, their life, maybe the healthcare system, like all of these things, and they're just going to use it as a battering ram to take the power that they want. And I think it seems maybe they've learned enough lessons from the last time they weren't able to overturn the government that if, like you said, if Trump gets into power, you're not going to see much more violence because they found different different collaborators that will just allow them to do whatever they want moving forward. Like, do you have an idea of what the playbook might be in 2025 if this election goes sideways?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and in fact, we have something called Project 2025. You reminded me of a quote, and I just pulled it up because I want to share it. So one of the quotes that I included in the January 6th report, if people remember, there was some really awful and amazing video footage from that insurrection that was released pretty much the day after from the New Yorker. And it's the footage that shows the insurrectionists praying on the dais in the U.S. Senate. And I spoke, as part of this report, I spoke to Luke Mogelson, who shot that video. And Luke is a war correspondent. That's normally what he does. and he happened to be there that day. And he explained it to me like this. He said, quote, "The Christianity was one of the surprises to me in covering that day, and it's been hugely underestimated. The Christian nationalism you talk about is the driving force and the unifying force of these disparate players. It's really the Christianity that ties it all together." And I mean, I think that that is crucial. And I mean, if people are curious about this, because you're right that there are all these disparate players on January 6th, but I think Luke really nailed it in that quote, and it's one of the reasons I concluded my section with it, because that it was the glue that bound all of them together. For instance, when Paula White gave her prayer to open the rally at the beginning of that, she added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer, which is written in Matthew chapter 6, right? She added a prayer. She added America to a prayer that, according to the Bible, Jesus himself wrote, right? Like, I mean, that is Christian nationalism, right? Impromptu worship concerts broke out on the walk to the Capitol. The Proud Boys, right, who a lot of people don't think of as Christian nationalists, they were hailed as God's warriors on that walk, and they knelt in prayer on the way, and that this prayer was full of this typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation, right? One attacker carried the Christian flag onto the floor of the U.S. Senate. The self-proclaimed QAnon shaman, who is now running for office in Arizona, led a prayer in the Senate about patriotism and Jesus and restoring the nation. I went and I identified a lot of those people who took part in that prayer, who were on the floor of the Senate. And one of them gave an interview later and said that they consecrated the Senate to Jesus. And that to me is the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement, right? He's not wrong. Another one of the insurrectionists who prayed said, "I just wanted to get inside the building so I could plead the blood of Jesus over it. That was my goal." And I watched this video where he spends 40 minutes recounting every action he took, all of it he believed directed by God. Right? There's another insurrectionist who is filming herself sipping this post-assault beer, and she's telling her social media followers why she attacked the beating heart of American democracy. And she says, "To me, God and country are tied. They're one and the same. We were founded as a Christian country, and we see how far we have come from that. We are a godly country founded on godly principles." Right? And that should take everybody who's listening back to the beginning of this conversation, because the idea that we are a Christian country and have strayed from those founding principles, that is the central tenet of Christian nationalism. Right. So, I mean, and some of the most famous imagery from that day had elements of Christian nationalism if you just look a little bit deeper. So, for instance, everybody recalls the gallows from that day, right?
Right.
They wrote on the gallows as if it was a yearbook. And they wrote things like "hang 'em high" and "hang for treason," but they also wrote "in God we trust" and "God bless America" and "Amen." Well, and if you remember the zip tie guy, yeah. I mean, if you remember the zip tie guy and the Confederate flag guy and the splinter mob that Officer Eugene Goodman lured away from lawmakers, there are elements of Christian nationalism in every one of those, and I lay them all out in the report. And then, I mean, of course, you can look at the signs and the flags and all of that. The Christian nationalism really was pretty clear that day.
Sadly, it does make so much sense because, like, I mean, their symbol of peace is a man being tortured on a cross. So it wouldn't surprise me that they would put "in God we trust" on the gallows. Or, like, if you want to take a subset of people who are experts in basically believing something that isn't true, well, I guess just making up whatever the founding of the nation is, and then your pastor tells you, your neighbor tells you, all the people that are more God-fearing people tell you, well, then you're just going to believe more things together that already aren't real. So why not just add on the founding of our nation? And I mean, one thing that does scare me about the U.S. is, since I'm living in Spain and since I've moved here over the years, I've watched a lot of these Civil War documentaries. And even after World War II ended, the Allies basically just left Spain alone to be run by Franco. And the early days in the 30s of when Franco came to power, the idea was, which I didn't even know this, was that Spain used to be this really debative sort of society, like a very lively patio cafe culture where people are debating the policy and laws and business and all of these things. And Franco and his wife were very strong Catholics. And a few of the documentaries gave me the idea. I don't know the veracity, but I saw it over a couple of documentaries that like a lot of their party just were sick of having debates. They just wanted things to be the way that they believed they should be, which is what I'm seeing in the U.S. as well.
Mhm.
And as they took over in crazily bloody civil war, which they did win, it was even found out in the last 5 years that they were stealing children from the opposition and giving them to people that supported their party. And it was something like 300,000 or 400,000 kids were basically taken from the. I think they were the. I don't know who the Republicans, who were the Nationalists, but like you'd have twins, and they would just take one of the nuns would take one, and then give it to someone that supports Franco, and they only found these people recently. So it just sends chills down my
Mhm.
spine for what the eventually end game or what this could turn into if they do become the reigning power in the US that don't want to essentially cede power after they get another 4 years. So you said you had a Project 2025.
Yeah, I mean, Project 2025 is it's put out by the Heritage Foundation. It's basically what their blueprint for what they would do if Trump were to win again, and it's essentially wipe out the federal government and institute an authoritarian regime that I don't know
Seriously?
that our country would recover from. I mean, I'm oversimplifying that and overstating it, but not by much. Um,
Right.
and I mean that's one of the reasons that I do the work that I do, and why I try to build these broad coalitions to oppose Christian nationalism, including with many Christians. Some of my great friends these days and great allies in this fight are Christians. In fact, there's a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism that I do some work with, and that's because right now shared values matter more than shared beliefs.
Hmm.
Um, and that's especially true when we face an existential threat like white Christian nationalism. So my dream, and this is going to get to your point, would be to live in a country where the separation of church and state is valued by everybody, where we all understand that true religious freedom can only exist with a secular government, right? Where we get that there is no freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. I want to live in a country where the nonprofits that I work for, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State, are unnecessary. I want a country where I can get together and have these deep and fascinating conversations on a patio or a coffee shop, as you mentioned, about God and about the nature of the universe and why we're all here, and disagree with my Christian friends about those
Right.
things and tell them why they're wrong. But at this moment, we are fighting a movement that would, if it seizes power again, that would make those conversations impossible, that would privilege conservative white Christians above everybody else, that would create an America where there really is two classes. So our country is on fire right now. I don't think our democracy is slipping away. It's being stolen. The republic is being strangled. And those of us who share values like equality and justice and truth and fairness, we have to come together to stop that arsonist, that thief, and that murderer. And that means stopping and fighting white Christian nationalism. That means fighting for an America where the separation of church and state is not just absolute, but is valued. And that really is the choice that we face right now. And it gets to the quote that you mentioned earlier, right? Where I say that America will never be a Christian nation because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. And that's because those two things cannot peacefully exist. One of them is going to triumph. So this is the choice that America faces as a nation: Christian nationalism or America, because we genuinely cannot have both.
I think the most frustrating part of that is that these Christian nationalists will all act like they're being persecuted. Or in the
Oh
end,
yeah.
if you and the Christians Against Christian Nationalism and everyone who wants a division of church and state, like nothing would happen to them. They would still be able to have churches and live their lives however they want to live. Like that is the idea of America, as to your point. But if the Christian nationalists come into power, like what things start closing on Sundays, maybe there's no marriage equality. Who knows about contraception, and who knows how far that goes to make trans people illegal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the risk is not small by any stretch of the imagination, not to mention what their ideas on economics and etc. are, which I'm sure would be kind of insane. I'm sure we could see that happening. But why is it that nobody, not nobody, because obviously you and everyone on your team is fighting on this as well, but why does it seem like nobody really thinks that this is a real threat? Like I only talk about this with a few people because I'm a recovered Catholic,
Mm.
so to speak, and like I know so many Catholics and Christians and wonderful people like you were saying, but it doesn't seem anyone really realizes what the U.S. could turn into in a real situation that
Yeah.
could happen after this November.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's changing. Let me start with a little bit of hope there because I do think that's changing. I remember in 2019, so this is right after the founding myth came out. Um, I was talking to a room full of like 200 plus religion reporters, and I was on a panel about Christian nationalism, and I said to them that Christian nationalism is an existential threat to a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Explain that Christian nationalism is un-American. And I mean, this is 200. This should be their beat. They should know this stuff. And it was just crickets. It was nothing, And meanwhile, cut fast forward to 16 months later, and you get January 6th, and they're basically Christian nationalists are running out to prove me right. And I'd far rather be wrong. But I have seen. I mean, I've been talking about and educating about and fighting Christian nationalism for more than a decade now.
Right.
And I have seen a sea change really since January 6th. I thought for a minute, like right after January 6th, we were going to break through, but it turns out it took a lot longer. I mean, there are a couple of documentaries that are coming out now, including a big one that Rob Reiner is producing called God and Country. I think really the country is starting to wake up to the threat that Christian nationalism poses. You're seeing a lot more people talk about it. You're hearing a lot more about it, including in the editorial pages of big papers like the New York Times. People are becoming familiar with what it is. So I do think that is changing, and I think that the more we talk about it, one of the things is that the threat of Christian nationalism is inherent in that phrase. There are a lot of people who want to talk about dominionism, the Seven Mountains dominionism, and the Seven Mountains Mandate, and the New Apostolic Reformation, and all of these different flavors of Christian nationalism. And even you can go back to like the religious right and the moral majority and things like that. And it's sort of like it's almost like talking about different really esoteric strains of cancer when you can just say cancer. And like talking about Christian
Right.
nationalism as a threat to the country is the way to talk about it, and it's the way to get people to understand what we're fighting against and the threat that it poses. So anybody listening that is having these conversations, I'd really encourage you to use that phrase, Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, and avoid all of the other things, which can be very useful in scholarly contexts and especially when you're studying the various strains, but it's not useful when you're messaging about it.
Right. Yeah. If you're going to talk about Omicron and Delta, just say it's COVID.
Yeah,
It is what it is. I guess I want to take a step back because you mentioned the Heritage Foundation in 2025,
Yeah.
and then you said that in not so vague terms that they want to install this authoritarian government. I was hoping you could be more specific and really paint the picture for what that. Because I'm also curious what that 2025 mandate from the Heritage Foundation is saying.
I mean, it's a playbook that's
Specifically.
out there, and people, you
Yeah.
can go read it now. The meaning, when did it drop? And the media got a hold of it like 4 or 5 months ago now, and there's a PDF out there. I want to say it's like 400 pages. I mean, essentially, it's dismantling the administrative state, so getting rid of the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency, all of those things that like help people. Let's just get rid of all of those. Getting rid of most of the federal workforce, and then implementing a lot of other things too that truly would make it difficult to unseat Trump. And you pair that with all of what we saw happen during the first Trump presidency with tearing down those basic democratic norms, and we saw things like how, for instance, impeachment is not an effective check. You mentioned checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution before, and that's one of the things that our framers of the Constitution did that was truly useful, because it prevents any one source or seat of power from getting too much concentrated power and overrunning the other branches. They're meant to be in competition, for instance. And I think we saw that impeachment was supposed to be a check on an out of control executive or an out of control Supreme Court justice, for instance. And it's not. It doesn't work at all. It is completely. It's impotent. It has no power to do what it is supposed to do, which is remove somebody from office and prevent them from holding office again. Right? If you can incite a violent insurrection in an effort to maintain power, to stop the peaceful transfer of power, which is what Trump did. That the peaceful transfer of power has been the hallmark of American democracy since the beginning. It's one of the reasons we revere George Washington in this country, not just because he was our first president, but because after 2 terms as president, he stepped down and willingly passed his power to his successor. And that didn't happen at the time. I mean, that was like really, really an amazing moment in human history. And that continued, that peaceful transfer of power continued for basically ever until Trump. And then, if that person can stay in office after trying to stop that, vital American tradition that is at the heart of the American experiment, then impeachment is worthless. So I really, I deeply, deeply am worried. The amount of damage that Trump would do this time, I think would be catastrophic. I mean, last time they caught the tiger by the tail, nobody expected them to win, including themselves. They didn't have a plan going in. Basically, the only thing they were able to accomplish, other than the tax cuts for the rich, was to capture the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is already gone, but we would also see, for instance, Sam Alito and Justice Thomas, maybe even Justice Roberts would retire. You'd get young, new conservatives in there that would ruin the court, continue the capture of the court for another 50 years.
Wow.
Not that the court might not even be that useful. They're doing so much damage already. So, I mean, it really is. It's too much of a nightmare scenario. And I'm dancing around the question a little bit deliberately, but this is easily and without doubt the most consequential election in our nation, certainly in my lifetime. And I think the only response is to make it such an overwhelming loss for Donald Trump, such an overwhelming victory against Donald Trump, that there is no possible question. I mean, it can't be close. We can't be having an election that's decided by 40,000 votes in 3 states, which is what we had last time. It's got to be an overwhelming victory against this maniac.
Right. Yeah, and you hope that in those deciding states, the Republican governors or whomever the apparatus haven't learned how to
well, I mean, this is one of the scary things, Mike. The Trump campaign team has been going around and purging the Republican officials that had a backbone in the last election, and making sure that their loyalists are in place in those Republican states. And the goal of what Trump was trying to do with January 6th, to stop the peaceful transfer of power, was to all he had to do was call the election into question. And then what would have happened, because of the way that our system works, is the votes would have been tossed out and the election would have gone to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, the way it works is each state gets 1 vote for president. And in that instance, Trump would have been appointed president by the House of Representatives. That's what he was trying to do. That was the end goal of his plan. He was really close to accomplishing it. And now you've got somebody... You've got a Christian nationalist now who is the Speaker of the House. Now that could change over with the election, because those would change first before the presidential votes would be tallied. But it's terrifying.
Yeah, it is really close. And even people like I know that aren't Christians or a Christian light, like they don't think that the insurrection or January 6th was this big thing. And so that's the part that really scares me. And so that's another reason actually I wanted to have you on, because you do really give me hope. For as crazy as I think America is and the circus that is going on over there, I have over the years went from thinking this idea of, oh, I'm more European, I'm Canadian, America bad, but I've really come to appreciate the history of America and the American experiment and how really important it is to have in the world. And if that goes the way of the Bible, man,
Well, let
I don't
me
know. So yeah, go ahead,
let me take 2 minutes at the end here to give you a little more hope,
please.
because despite everything, I really do have hope. And the wellspring of my hope it's a basic definitional truth. Their power hungry aggression is growing our movement, right? So the Christian nationalist wins, in the abortion case, for instance, in all of the cases that I detail in American Crusade. Even their policy wins, getting Johnson elected speaker. Their wins swell our ranks. So remember the why. The whole reason they're turning to Christian nationalism in the first place is demographics. White Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. So every victory that they notch alienates more people. It wakes more people up to the danger. It drives more people away from their already unpopular ideology. So they are creating a feedback loop. Their power hungry aggression is growing our movement. And they're crusading because we're working to meet the unmet promise in the US Constitution, right? The simple idea that we the people means everyone, means all the
Right.
people. And as we march toward that progress, they're fighting ever harder against it. The Christian nationalists are not going to go gently. They're going to rage against the dying of their privilege. But in the end, we are going to win because they fight only for themselves. And where they are selfish, we can be selfless. They want supremacy, we want equality. And that is why in the end, we're going to win. And it's not because our principle is inherently better than theirs, though that is 100% true. But it's because the math is on our side. We have the numbers. And that's what they are fighting. That's what they are raging against. And they can rage all they want, but they can't fight math. And so I have hope. And I do offer solutions in both American Crusade and the Founding Myth, but none of them are quick or easy. This is going to be a long fight, both to win. We have the immediate fight coming up in the election, but we also have a Supreme Court that's been captured, that's doing a ton of damage. We have to organize and message in ways that are going to build power and fight to realize those aspirational ideals of freedom and equality and democracy. And that's the work that I do every day. At Americans United, that's what I try to do in American Crusade. That's what I try to do in the Founding Myth. That's why I do what I do, period.
Right. I guess with that said, as we wrap up, is there anything that Americans listening at home or abroad can do beyond voting that you think would help add some steam to the movement of protecting the 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 founding of America?
Yeah, the proof that one truly believes is in action. Bayard Rustin said that. I'd encourage people to go join groups like Americans United for Separation of Church and State, AU.org. I'd encourage people to go get my books from the library, which my publisher hates it when I say that, but go support your local library. If you really want to support it, have your library go buy it. I really do believe that getting involved in the election is absolutely crucial because of what I said. This has to be a landslide against Trump. He has to be buried in the popular vote. And I also encourage anybody, if you are listening to this and you've stuck with us to this through the end of this conversation, and I guess if you're not hate listening, you should run for office. And I go all over the country and I talk about this with people. And one of the common refrains I hear against that is, well, Andrew, I'm not qualified for office. I don't know anything about running for office. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert. Okay. If you're listening to this, you're more qualified. So go run for local office. Go run for school board.
It'd be even funnier if it wasn't so sad.
Yes, it would be.
Those two maniacs. But
Yeah.
Captain America, I love that shield I see in the corner over there.
That was a
thank you for being here, and thanks
gift.
for all the hard work you're doing. I'm obviously it is not without risks, considering how the other side is. And so even as a non-immigrant, just as a citizen that cares about America on the map, thank you so much for everything you're doing.
I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.